My name is Seth Rockman, and I'm a professor of history at Brown University, where I've taught for the last 20 some years. And I'm a scholar of the United States, particularly between the era of the American Revolution and the Civil War. And my scholarship is mostly focused on the histories of capitalism, the histories of slavery, and labor in the American past.
And that's great. We're going to be talking about a book that kind of lands squarely in your expertise that you wrote, I think, last year, called Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery. So if you could begin by telling us what brought you to look at these particular material goods and what you may have discovered in your research.
Yeah, I should start by saying, of course, this book was not just written in the last year. This book took forever. Like many good scholarly books do, this has been about a 15-year project of a lot of archival work and then a lot of writing and rewriting to get the story right and to be able to present it in a way that I thought would connect with audiences who want to think more about the complexities of the American past. So, as a scholar, I've long been interested in the relationship of slavery and capitalism, and this is this really thorny question for people who study the history of the United States, because presumably we fought a civil war that pitted slavery against capitalism. And that fact of a free labor North versus a slaveholding South has colored the way in which many scholars have interpreted an earlier phase of American history when people, of course, did not know that the Civil War was coming just around the corner. And so much of my book is about the ways in which from the 18 teens, 1820s, into the 30s and 40s, and even into the 1850s, the economies of New England and the North and the economies of the slaveholding South were less antagonistic and more symbiotic in their relationship to one another. And I wanted to think through ways in which we could see that symbiosis, not in the abstract, but in the lives of actual Northerners and Southerners going about their business. And so one of the ways it seemed to make sense to make this as concrete or tangible as possible was to focus on very mundane things that many of us today would have experience using, whether we're talking about a shovel or a hat or shoes or the clothing on our bodies, and thinking about the ways in which we follow, say, something like an axe from a factory in Connecticut into the hands of an enslaved man chopping down the forest in Alabama to create lands for cotton cultivation, that the movement of that axe and the lives of the people who made it and the lives of the people who used it, we could tell virtually any story about interconnection in the American past. And we could really see the ways in which these relationships were seen and oftentimes not seen by the people at that time.
Yeah, and I'd love for you to begin by kind of giving us an overview of what what northern
Mhm.
manufacturing looked like and what the slave plantation system looked like. And I mean, we kind of know both, but in conversation with each other, what was that high level interaction?
Right. So yeah, the story of New England's Industrial Revolution is one that is fairly well known, and it's often sort of centered on like the Lowell textile mills, where all these farm girls throughout the New England countryside came and lived, and this was the first sort of mechanized factories, and this set the North on its way. But the texture of New England industrialization was much more uneven than that. And it really isn't going to be until after the Civil War that you see the kind of integrated factories where a bale of cotton might come in one end and a stack of clothing might come out the other. Most industrial production in the earlier part of the 19th century might involve some materials that are made in a factory, other processes that might be done in people's homes, with then the finished products returning to the factory. So, for example, it was relatively easy to mechanize the spinning of yarn, but it was comparatively harder to mechanize the weaving of that yarn. So New Englanders in the first decades of the 19th century had a glut of factory produced yarn, but that would then be turned out to rural families who would often weave it into fabric on their own looms and then send that fabric back to the so-called factory in order to be finished, perhaps fulled or treated in some kind of other way, and then packaged and then sold. So one of the things then is that it's not just simply people who are the sort of frontline American proletarians who show up in the factory who are part of this system. It's the farm girl sitting at her loom in southern Rhode Island who, after her day of milking cows and trying to grow some onions for her family, is also going to spend 6 hours at the loom trying to produce enough yards of cloth that at the end of the week the family can take it back to the so-called manufacturer and trade that, 50 yards of cloth for a certain number of store credits that they can use to purchase molasses or butter or to pay their rent even or to buy nicer fabrics than the ones that they were involved in making. And all of this is very much because New England's Industrial Revolution got off to a pretty rocky start, as one might expect. This was a region that didn't have a lot of capital to just start dumping into mechanization. This was a place where there were lots of people who had ideas about how to harness water power to make things better, but not a huge amount of skill. And they were, of course, like 50 years behind Britain at this period of time. Britain already had really a pretty intense period of industrial development over the 18th century. And Britain was manufacturing many of the goods that American slaveholders were using to furnish their plantations. And one of the aspirations for then these New England manufacturers was to bump these British manufacturers out and to capture this market for the United States so that the United States could have a kind of economic independence that might be comparable to its political independence. But if you think about this, then you think, okay, so I'm an aspiring New England manufacturer, and I've got a water wheel and some making of a factory. I don't know. I don't really have a skilled workforce. I don't have a lot of capital to invest in better manufacturing. I probably can only start out making pretty crappy stuff. Well, okay, then you're going to look and say, well, where's the biggest market for crappy stuff? And it's not the most lucrative market, but it is a very good market if you have a low skilled workforce and pretty rudimentary technology. And so a lot of these New England manufacturers figure that they will cut their teeth making things for slave plantations with the assumption that slaveholders aren't going to spend a lot of money and don't really care too much about quality. And that over 20 or 30 years of maybe doing that, they can then gain the skill and gain the revenue to invest in better machinery to move into more lucrative markets, making better fabrics or better shoes for middle class or even upper class consumers in other parts of the United States. But for a lot of these manufacturers in New England, they're like, oh, it turns out that slaveholders are incredibly discerning consumers and they don't want to just purchase crap. They want goods that they can claim are made expressly for the use of their enslaved workers and goods that they can say prove that we are, good stewards of our people, as they would call the men, women, and children that they legally owned. And so we don't want to give them crap. We want to give them only the finest of these textiles, which is not true. But it creates an opportunity, or I should say a fiction, that slaveholders can use, northern manufacturers can use, but also enslaved people can use when they say, I noticed that these people on the neighboring plantation, they got, the Hazard's double Kiersey patented cloth. We should get some of that. And next thing you know, they're making claims on the people who enslaved them for higher quality goods. And so the fiction, indeed, that this is a really sophisticated and differentiated consumer market actually works for a lot of people's interests simultaneously.
That's not the only fiction that kind of sustains the system, is it? Because we have this idea that the North was completely slave free and slave um, economically liberated as well. But as you kind of alluded to in your answer just before, the North becomes more and more entangled in the Southern economy and also in slavery itself. And part of that, I think, if you could talk about that, but then also what was the cash economy? What we think of things in today's terms, but back then, the way money and credit and all of that seems incredibly important to what we're talking about.
Yes, this is exactly right. So let me break this up into two pieces. So the first part that you asked about is simply about the North's entanglement in the slave system. And it's absolutely true that even as, say, New England moves out of the transatlantic slave trade at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, and even as many New England states develop gradual emancipation laws that will free the children of the enslaved people who presently live in those states, New England does not, in fact, all of a sudden have clean hands after 1808. And indeed, a region that's whose industrial revolution is largely organized around cotton spinning and cotton weaving has to be connected to the source of that cotton, which at that moment in time is exclusively grown by enslaved Americans working on Southern plantations. So it's very much present. One of the ways I talk about it in the book is to use a kind of anachronistic term, which is offshoring, and to say that New England offshored its slavery. We use the term offshoring today to talk about companies, for example, that might move their money into tax havens in the Caribbean or in some other part of the country, or even companies that might move their production to places that have lower labor standards or non-unionized workers who can be paid less. And so if we think about offsourcing as a way to simply move one's business into a different regulatory regime where the rules of your own society don't apply, we can say that New Englanders managed to clear their own region of slavery, perhaps, but offshored all of their participation in the slave trade and would come to have as much interest in the price of cotton or the price of an enslaved man or woman as virtually any Southerner would at this time as well. And part of that sort of notion that New Englanders had this remote interest in the slave system had to do with the second part of your question, which was about sort of how this economy actually worked, particularly in terms of payment. Now, you have to remember that this is not a moment in time when there is a unified national currency. This is not a moment when the government simply has issued paper money that everyone says this is backed by the US government, and if it's a bill that says 20 on it, it's worth 20, and you just send me that. And the national banking system is underdeveloped, and after Andrew Jackson ends the Second Bank of the United States, it's kind of monetary chaos by the end of the 1830s. So this means that moving money from your customers in Charleston or New Orleans back to a merchant in Philadelphia or New York or Boston, and then to a manufacturer in a rural part of New England, and then to a worker who's expecting to be paid, there are so many different kinds of transactions here that ultimately create a very convoluted situation. Almost all of this business is done on credit, and this is an interesting thing. So if a New England manufacturer sends, 1,000 axes to a Charleston merchant, or sends 500 pairs of shoes to an enormous Louisiana sugar planter, the terms are always 6 months, 8 months credit. And so, in some ways, right, these New Englanders are lending Southerners the productive tools that they will need for the next crop, and then hope to be paid with the revenue that comes out of that crop. So, in essence, New Englanders are functioning as the creditors for the continuation of the plantation economy for another year. And that's why I say they have to hope for a really good crop because that's the only prospect they have of getting paid. But when it's then time to get paid, there are two things that happen. I mean, sometimes Southern merchants will pay them in actual cotton and other raw materials that New England manufacturers need for their production. But the other thing that's kind of interesting is that a lot of the Southern cotton business runs through New York City. It's usually New York boats with New York insurance, with New York sailors who are carrying the bales of cotton from, say, New Orleans or Mobile to ports in England, which is the largest sort of market for slave-grown cotton. And what that means is that remittances from England come back to New York City banks. And so if you are a Southern slaveholder, you oftentimes have credit in New York City banks and thus have money to spend there. So that means that New England manufacturers send their goods to New York City and have most of the transactions take place there. And that takes at least some of the risk out of having to wait for the next year's crop. But it's still a very uncertain thing at a moment when there is no unitary monetary standard. And I think anyone reading this book who's been following the current financial news, who's thinking about what it would mean to sort of, move into a world of unregulated cryptocurrency, learning about the 1830s and 1840s should disabuse everyone of the idea that this would be good. It would not be good.
Yeah, it seemed like a completely convoluted house of cards. And when I tried to get my head wrapped around it, I didn't understand how anyone got paid for anything. And
Yep.
then, but I liked how you undergirding it all, I guess, is the slave economy. Because if a planter had a bad year or whatever, their main capital to liquidate would be slaves. So you could actually generate cash by auctioning off your workforce, right?
Yeah, I mean, and this is the really distressing aspect of this economy. Northerners, when they sell $1,000 worth of goods to a Southern business or to a Southern slaveholder, usually don't ask for a direct kind of collateral or securitization. And they don't have to because the Southern courts, which are used to dealing with bankruptcies all the time, know that when someone can't pay their bills, their creditors sue them, their assets are then seized, and the sheriff sells them off. And everyone knows that the most valuable assets that Southerners own are other Americans who are held in bondage. So any Northern business doing a transaction with a Southern firm can be relatively confident that if they don't get paid, they can hire a lawyer, they can bring their customer to court, and the courts will order those assets to be sold. And those assets are ultimately enslaved men and women. It makes, at least in the eyes of the law, New Englanders then the legal owners of slaves in a certain kind of way when they become parties to these debt suits or to these bankruptcy suits. And this is one of the things that Northern abolitionists will call out. This was an interesting thing in this book, too, sort of thinking about the ways in which this business comes to have moral repulsion or doesn't at all. There are very, 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 very few Northern abolitionists, right? The most devoted, hardcore critics of slavery who are like locking themselves to the gates of the Lowell Mills saying your use of cotton here makes you complicit in this business. They are also spending very, very little time calling out the manufacturers of shoes and hats and shovels and shoes and axes that are providing the infrastructural support of the slave system. They just don't really spend time thinking that those people are their biggest problem and they kind of let them skate by. But when they find out that one of those businesses, in order to be paid, all of a sudden has affected a slave sale or has become the legal owner of enslaved men and women, then it raises a lot of alarms. And then there usually is a kind of moral revulsion. And this is one of those weird distinctions that 19th century white Americans seem to be able to draw that don't make much sense to us today, right? The difference between owning a fellow human being, which in their minds could be good or could be bad, and the buying and selling of a human being, which is bad, right? The slave auction is horror, but the plantation, I don't know, say many white Northerners, it might be okay if the owner is generous and kind and provides Christian train, whatever. They draw this distinction that doesn't make any sense to us because it's all bad.
And the cognitive dissonance has always been with us, I suppose. So the let's get into what a plantation good is. And I know in the book you string this family history of the hazards throughout this, and it really brings it to the ground because we're kind of still talking up here in lofty terms, but when we're talking about axes and hats and shoes and hoes and these things that the plantation owners needed from the North. Let's talk about how the design and marketing and the distribution, well, let's just do production first. How does the production of these tools and what you call plantation goods work? And yeah, let's talk about that.
Sure, sure. So the term plantation goods is a term that would have been familiar to 19th century Americans, North and South, black and white, enslaved and free, referring to that constellation of very mundane goods that would have been necessary to make a slave plantation function. So if you see a store advertisement saying, "We carry plantation goods," you would know that this meant that that store would carry shoes that purportedly were designed for enslaved people to wear, and hats that were purportedly for enslaved people to wear, and clothing and fabrics for enslaved people, and tools like hoes or axes or shovels that were necessary for daily work routines. I mean, we could expand that category of things that you need for plantations to things like cotton gins, which are largely manufactured to the north, or food, which is in many cases imported from the north. But I wanted to sort of, by most standard accounts, sort of plantation goods refers to these manufactured goods that would be necessary for using on the plantation. And it's interesting when you think about the history of American slavery. When American slavery in the 18th century was largely confined to the eastern seaboard and concentrated in the Chesapeake and places like Maryland and Virginia, particularly around tobacco and wheat, a lot of the manufacturing of textiles or a lot of the manufacturing of tools was done by enslaved people, right? Enslaved blacksmiths or enslaved weavers and seamstresses, which you would find, up and down the roster of Monticello and other large Virginia plantations. But as cotton cultivation comes to sort of boom in the 1820s and 1830s, and as American slaveholders begin to move from the eastern seaboard to newly sort of dispossessed land that had a generation earlier belonged to the Creek and other indigenous nations in the American South, and through war in the 18 teens quickly became new states like Alabama and Mississippi. This becomes a cotton frontier. And the kind of slaveholders who are moving to this cotton frontier, bringing men and women from places like Virginia and Maryland, they don't want to waste any labor doing things like making hose or making clothing. They want every ounce of labor they can in the fields growing and picking cotton because this is the lucrative sort of business model. So if I talked about New Englanders offshoring their slavery, I will also talk about slaveholders outsourcing the production of these kinds of goods. And so they outsource the manufacture of these goods to these New Englanders at precisely the moment these New Englanders are like, "Hey, we should have an industrial revolution." Well, we don't know how to make anything. Well, and next thing you know, there's this kind of synergy. And what New England manufacturers quickly learned is that Southern slaveholders and Southern enslaved people themselves are picky consumers. They have a lot of opinions about how a hoe should be made, or how a hat should look, or how clothing should or should not protect the body against the sharp edges of cotton plants. And New England manufacturers gather a lot of this information. They do it by writing to Southern slaveholders, but they also do it by what I call in the book plantation R&D. They spend a lot of time in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Louisiana, traveling from plantation to plantation, talking to slaveholders, but talking to enslaved people too about the qualities of a good, durable woolen cotton fabric. Should it be twill woven or plain woven? Should it be 32 inches wide or 36 inches wide? Should it be 14 ounces to the yard or 16 ounces to the yard? Should it be this or should it be that? Linen and wool, or wool and cotton, or all wool or all cotton. And they gather a lot of this information, they send it back to New England, and that largely dictates how this production works. New Englanders come to develop sort of proprietary knowledge. They develop textiles that they seek to get patents for. They develop hoes and shovels that they sell by name brands, so that if you were to look on the sort of catalog of a Southern agricultural implements dealer, you would see, oh, they sell the Scoville hoe from Haddam, Connecticut. Oh, they sell the Collins axe from Collinsville, Connecticut, right? Oh, they sell the Hazards cloth, right? This all would be there. And so it becomes a competitive business, and it becomes one in which brands actually matter a great deal. And Northerners spend a good deal of time trying to cultivate influential slaveholders, trying to get good reviews in Southern periodicals, and trying increasingly as the political controversies of the Civil War come to become ampli or leading up to the Civil War come to be amplified in the 1850s, they come to try to say, oh, no, 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 we have good politics. We're down with slavery. It's fine. We don't have anything to do with that Abraham Lincoln. You can trust us. And so that's another factor in how a Northern firm will maintain good business relations with the South.
Yeah, and we could go into a lot because the book deals with shoes and ready-made clothing and this sort of stuff. So maybe you could just talk a little bit more about pick one of your favorite examples and just to kind of illustrate how this dynamic worked between, as you say, plantation R&D and changing the product that the North then manufactured.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of examples that I like. I mean, one involves a hoe that is manufactured in Haddam, Connecticut by two brothers, Hezekiah and Daniel Scoville. And their dad had been a blacksmith in this small Connecticut town. They had some pretty rudimentary technology. And his sons, when they're in their late teens and early 20s, go off to, basically see where they can make their fortune. And if you're a young man on the make in New England in this period, one of the best places you can make your fortune is the South. So their sons go to the South and they try to see what it would be like to set up a hardware store there. And one of them becomes the apprentice to a merchant and so learns about how to keep books and all that. And quickly gets this idea that if they can build what they say as an indestructible hoe, they can become millionaires. So the brothers come back to Connecticut and they're like, Dad, we got to take over your factory and we got to put all of our energies into developing what we will call the self-sharpening planter's hoe. So we'll design it in this kind of way that the blade will be different from that the tip of the blade will be cast steel and it will presumably through use maintain its edge. And we have a lot of ideas for sort of how to attach it to the handle because these often break because the ways they're used, when they always talk about sort of, the rough usage, forgetting that the idea of course, slave resistance, that enslaved people, of course, are going to try to break their tools because that's the kind of thing that people do who are being compelled to work and don't want to work do. Right? They put the machinery out of order. So there's a lot of discussion about how do you make one that is unbreakable, et cetera, et cetera. And they roll out what we might call sort of, Ho 1.0, and they send it to a bunch of their business associates in Alabama saying, please try these out with your slaves. Let us know, if one, two, or three is the best one and how we can make improvements. And they get a lot of feedback. And by 1845, they're ready to roll out, Planter's Hoe 2.0. And they launch it by sending free samples to hardware merchants in Georgia and Alabama. They launch it by sending free samples to large slaveholders whose names they've gathered from different places. And then they say, and we'll travel through your town somewhere in the next year and we'll do a demonstration. And if these aren't the best hoes your slaves have ever used, your money back. Right? They do all the kind of ridiculous marketing that would be incredibly familiar to us today. And by the end of the 1850s, the Scovilles are turning out a very well-respected hoe, and they're also making a number of other hoes without their name on them that then New York hardware companies are distributing and vending as well. And so it is sort of when we think about this hoe, it didn't just sort of pop out of the head of a Northern inventor, it's kind of a collaborative process that involves test markets and testers and conversations that were never recorded, but that we know existed between enslaved people and slaveholders, where the enslaved person's interest in not being beaten by not being able to work as quickly as slaveholders wanted them, gave them an incentive and better tools. And the degree to which slaveholders want more output, so they have an incentive for better tools, but they don't want to spend too much money, so that sort of countering the other way. And New Englanders sort of feed into this, and it becomes then the hoe as sort of this collaborative invention rather than some artifact of New England genius, if we can use that term.
And that challenges some of the industrial myth that comes to play later. The let's talk about the marketing of these goods and how it actually contributed to race coding and further racial stereotyping, not only in the South, but more importantly in the North, and how these plantation goods were talked about and how they were advertised in the almanacs and the catalogs and all of that.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting dimension, and this is an important discussion within the book. The ways in which the manufacturing of these goods creates a national conversation between white people in the North and white people in the South about difference and about what makes what makes the difference between cloth and what they would call Negro cloth, to use a common racial term of the 19th century. And what's fascinating is the ways in which a label like Negro comes to affix, particularly to textiles that are made for slaves. And what differentiates Negro cloth from other cloth? Well, actually nothing, right? That same cloth, when a New Englander manufactures it and sends it to Ohio for a white farming family to wear, or sends it to upstate New York for an Irish canal digger on the Erie Canal to wear. It might be called Kiersey, it might be called coarse woolens, it might be called Welsh plains, it might be called any number of different things. It might be called jeans, which is a term in the 19th century for woolen fabrics. But when it's sold to the South with the intent for enslaved people to wear it, it's called Negro cloth. So the question becomes, what does that label do? It doesn't tell us anything about the cloth itself. So clearly it is doing other kind of work to identify it as different from the cloth that white people in the South might wear. But you might find that exact same cloth on plenty of white people in the North who would, of course, never admit to wearing Negro cloth because that would be humiliating to them and run counter to their racial antipathy to Black Americans, very few of whom they might actually know or encounter on a daily basis in so many of these rural New England communities. But so what difference does it make then if New Englanders and white Southerners are talking about what makes cloth into Negro cloth? Well, that conversation ends up being very much about bodily difference. Oh, black people are different because they perspire more, or black people are different because they're more susceptible to respiratory illnesses, which come from working in the morning dews, and therefore they need these kinds of cloths to protect their bodies, right? Or that they have different kinds of circulation, or that they have different preferences, whatever it might be. There's a discussion about bodily difference that runs through what suitable shoes are for black people who, in a racist stereotype that persists in the North, have enormous feet, far bigger feet than white people, or what kind of hats, or what kind of tools. And right, I mentioned before the ways in which white discussion about tools breaking almost never can imagine that this is actually a purposeful act of resistance. It's always, well, there are clumsy people, and therefore we need to make better tools. But even in that discussion of attributing broken tools to some kind of racial deficiency among black people, it again creates a world in which white people are talking all the time about difference and creating ideas about difference in the absence of knowing any black people or interacting with any black people because there's simply so few of them in the North. So in some ways, Negro cloth acts as a proxy for actual black people in the creation of white racial identities.
And can we talk about next how the Southern enslaver used Northern goods as an incentive and as a punishment to the enslaved? So I'm thinking about the dress for the woman who gets pregnant. I'm thinking about taking away tools from certain people who disobey or work slower. That kind of negotiation between the enslaved and the enslaver.
Yeah. So one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that we should think about slavery as fundamentally a system of labor exploitation, right? Slaveholders' interest is in extracting as much labor as possible from the men, women, and children whom they legally own, and to do so to create commodities to sell in the world market. So they have a big incentive in both maximizing productive output and in maintaining the value of the bodies of the people that they own. In this sense, there's a big disincentive for slaveholders to equip people with clothing that will leave them unable to work because they get sick because of exposure, or to provide them with tools that don't actually allow them to produce as much cotton as might be possible. And so I think the first and foremost consideration for enslavers is to find tools that are at a price point that they can live with, which is usually a very low price point, but that will allow them to achieve their economic goals. But then, of course, slaveholders don't want to be thought of as people who are simply exploiting labor. They want to be thought of as benevolent stewards of a population who can take care of itself or whatever other racist sort of ideas that they have. And so they also, of course, want to be seen as benevolent. They want to be seen as caring. And to that extent, what Northern manufacturers are selling them is the ability to perform this role. It doesn't mean that enslaved people think that it's generous of you to give me 6 yards of cloth this Christmas. Oh, thank you so much. But it allows slaveholders to be like, yes, and I'm doing my part according to these biblical precepts to care for my people, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's another one of their goals. But what they also quickly realize is that they can bring in positive and negative incentives to plantation space through clothing, through other kinds of provisions. And so we have a long list when we look at the ways in which slaveholders engage what at the time is called plantation management of offering positive incentives. Oh, let's have a contest to see who can pick the most cotton, and the winner will get another pair of shoes. Or if you do this kind of work, you will get a seventh yard of cloth each Christmas, or an eighth yard of cloth each Christmas. And of course, none of this buys the acquiescence of enslaved people. But enslaved people aren't going to get in the way of the kind of performance that slaveholders want to have if it means that they are going to be able to have a slightly higher material standard of living. But slaveholders also realize that the withholding of these kinds of goods can make real differences in people's lives and can have very much a punitive effect. So, as much as they might offer cloth as extra cloth as an incentive for women to bring children into the world, they might also withhold winter clothing or summer clothing or shoes from people who have been captured having run away, or people who have been recalcitrant and resistive in other kinds of ways. So when we look at the plantation management records that we have from plantations throughout the South, we see all sorts of rewards and punishment that run from or run through the provision of these plantation goods.
Yeah, thank you. And I think before we leave this topic, one of the things that I was most interested in when you were discussing this towards the end of the book was the inclusion of not staff, slave complaint, and how it factored into not only the design of some of the material, but also in that dynamic between enslaver and slave. So could you talk a little bit more about how the enslaved negotiated the space of the goods and were able to kind of voice some resistance and complaint?
Yeah, yeah. So it just sort of for readers or for listeners who haven't looked at the book, right? The book, it gets you from the point of production to point of consumption. So it starts in these New England communities and it moves through all the manufacturing stuff, and then it moves through all the middlemen when these things are being given out, and then finally these goods arrive in the South. And first, we spent some time talking about those goals that slaveholders have for these goods, which we just discussed. But the book's final chapters are about enslaved people as the end users, or as one scholar has called them, involuntary consumers, who don't have a huge amount of choice to exercise about this one or that one, but who nonetheless have a certain degree of consumer agency in having strong opinions about these goods and making those opinions known. And one of the things that I argue in this discussion is that, of course, enslaved people know the slaveholders better than the slaveholders know themselves. They understand what's making these people tick. They understand thus how to manipulate them and enslave people who are not necessarily able to wage a full frontal attack on slavery because that would be suicidal when you're up against a population that has all of the guns. But you're playing the long game and you're waiting for your moment and you're fighting a war of attrition and you're wearing the system down and you're never acquiescing to its legitimacy. If that's really what the everyday politics of enslaved people looks like, waiting for the ultimate day of possibility, but each day trying to grind the system down little by little, then these plantation goods become a useful vehicle for this. They become a space where enslaved people can introduce all sorts of trouble and mischief into the system in a certain kind of way. So when an enslaved man says to his owner, you know, I was just down on the Jones plantation and they just all got new shoes and they look good. Those shoes look really good. Jones must be doing really well this year, right? That man who says that, right, he understands the kind of competitive honor culture among white men. He knows that he's basically just emasculated his own owner because he told him that this Jones guy is doing way better. And usually the result of that is, oh, I'll show that Jones, I'll get my people two pair, you know, and so this kind of stuff comes, again, not to buy enslaved people off, like, oh, we got better shoes, but simply to say we're going to try to extract as much from this system as we can, so long as it holds us in bondage until we have the kind of possibilities to escape from this bondage. And I argue that, in fact, the kinds of collective work that goes into telling stories about these goods by enslaved people is kind of practice for the cross plantation collaborations and efforts that will emerge during the Civil War itself when enslaved people engage largely in this process of self-emancipation by fleeing to Union lines and undermining the efforts of their owners to withstand Northern military occupation. So there's definitely a lot there. I mean, in many cases, right, enslaved people also try to use this clothing or use these tools to their own ends, right? Those axes are pretty powerful weapons. And every time there's a slave rebellion, like with Nat Turner, it's those axes that are cutting off white people's heads. And that's no joke. But it's also taking clothing that slaveholders have issued and repurposing it or remaking it or modifying it in ways that allow clothing that might be intended to make people feel drab or uniform, and instead giving people the opportunity to individuate or to make themselves feel beautiful. And this adds a lot of work to the lives of enslaved people. But for most scholars who study the kind of strategies of resistance that exist on American plantations, there is a lot of attention to the ways in which men and women alike use fashion and use other modes of self-expression as a way of maintaining dignity and maintaining possibility and possessing joy in the midst of unrelenting suffering.
Yeah, and we're going to skip over the Civil War, and which we can do because we're hundreds of years away from it. But the I want to talk about the historical narrative that emerges post-war, where the free North and the slave South both develop kind of an excuse or a vision of the antebellum period that is very self-serving to both interests. So could you explain to us how the free North and the slave South turn on this symbiotic relationship as you describe throughout the book and reframe it to fit their own narratives?
Yeah, it's a pretty funny thing that happens after the Civil War. So, I mean, one thing to say though that's worth noting is that a lot of these firms in the North that have been manufacturing tools for slaves or clothing for slaves, these people are not dragged kicking and screaming into the Civil War. Oh no, how terrible that we're losing all of our business in the South. They, in many ways, are business people who think that in the long run, the United States will be better without slavery. They like the economic policies of the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, which offers them tariffs and offers them national investment in infrastructure and banking. And this all actually sounds pretty good to most Northern business people. And they also, of course, see the possibility of emancipated slaves as becoming wonderfully lucrative consumers who have more money to spend in the future. But the other thing that sort of insulates the transition is that once the war starts, these same factories in the North that had been making clothing for slaves and tools for slaves immediately start making things for the Union Army. They get large government contracts, and clothing that last year was Negro cloth is this year called, Union enlisted man blue. And so they don't suffer too bad. And of course, the North is victorious in the war. And when the war is over, these firms, which continue to develop and continue to grow, largely with this infusion of government capital, they expand their production, they move into other kinds of markets that differentiate their product lines, and they erase all of this earlier history from their business narratives. So when you find, the 100-year account of the so-and-so factory that's published in 1894 or in 1912, it says, this firm got its start in the 1820s, and by 1870 it was, blah, 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 blah. And it just erases all of this kind of business and the fact that a lot of these firms gained a good deal of their capital and a good deal of their expertise by making things for slaves. This is just forgotten about. So this history is completely erased. Meanwhile, for Southerners, right, who are nursing the wounds of the war's loss and who feel like they're being exploited economically by carpetbaggers and, by the Reconstruction government, for them, they're able to say this is just a continuation of the ways in which those northern businessmen have been fleecing us all along. They forced all of these cheap goods on us and they stole our money. And then they had the nerve to pretend to be against slavery when in fact they were the real beneficiaries of slavery. They also create a very, very self-serving narrative that distorts the kind of symbiosis that had existed in the period before the American Civil War.
Great. So if you were going to kind of summarize um, this argument you've made and how these goods worked in history, what would you what's your elevator pitch for the book, kind of summing it all?
Yeah, no. So obviously, I want people to read this book because it tells you a lot of things about different kinds of lives and different kinds of possibilities in the 19th century. And it allows people to think about how being the land of opportunity went hand in hand with being the land of oppression, and that these are not stories that we can tell separately. These are stories that, in fact, need one another. But in many ways, my goal with this book, actually, if you can imagine, is to also say something about our time and about the lives that we live. And, as I spent all this time writing about these 19th century New Englanders who were making goods for slaves and who didn't think too much about it or who thought of themselves as actually doing good because if they didn't make shoes for the slaves would be barefoot and that would be worse, right? All the kinds of justifications and rationalizations and self-serving fictions that people tell themselves all the time. I thought about how we're going to be judged 200 years from now. Historians in, 2340 are going to look back at people like us and be like, can you believe that they talked all this stuff about, oh, they're so concerned with global warming and they use paper straws, but then they like drive these trucks or fly to Europe and do all these, and what hypocrites. And I'm like, but I don't think of it as hypocrisy. I think we're more complicated. I mean, I would like to think that it's not hypocrisy, it's that it's impossible for people to opt out of large systems, that individual effort to sort of change the world is much harder than we might seem it to be, and that I'm not quite sure that we should hold people in the past to standards that we would be uncomfortable being held to ourselves. And this makes me think that we're not better than people in the past, and people in the past aren't better than us. But all of us actually share a common experience. We're not the first people. Our generation is not the first to deal with a globalized economy, to deal with the fact that our consumer choices have ramifications for people's lives thousands of miles away, living in other parts of the world under other kinds of regimes. We are entangled, and we think about these entanglements a lot, but not always. Or we think about some entanglements and not others, right? So I could be very, very worked up about fast fashion and refuse to buy my daughter clothing from these manufacturers that exploit child labor in Bangladesh. But I don't spend too much time thinking about the rare earth mineral mining that is taking place with child labor in West Africa that provides me with my iPhone because I can't give up my iPhone. So does that make me a hypocrite? No, it's just really complicated. And so I wanted people to think about our own experience and our own time and our own moral sensibility and our own sense of conflict and to gain some perspective on it by recognizing that plenty of Americans, North and South, black and white, enslaved and free, were dealing with these same kinds of issues several hundred years ago. And ideally, we can gain some insight into the kind of future we want by thinking about this past in this more complicated way.